Hello, this is Kate Stillman with the Yoga Healer podcast, and I'm here with Joanne Spence, the author of Trauma Informed Yoga. And you're a recovering social worker and a certified yoga therapist. And through your own healing journey, you found yoga, and you've been able to help a lot of people into yoga who might not otherwise have found it in order to heal from trauma. So tell us a little bit, Joanne, about your story and how what the trauma was and how you discovered yoga.
Yeah, so there's lots of layers of trauma, and when I use the word trauma, I use it in its broadest sense of anything that might happen that overwhelms one's current capacity to cope. But my reason for even having yoga on my radar and trying it as a practice um, was because I was in a car accident 20 years ago. So there was an event. So a traumatic event was the car accident. And it was a good 2 years where I was healed, and all of the parts that were broken were now healing. My knee, and I had a full body whiplash, and I looked fine, but I really wasn't, and chronic pain had set in. I was depressed, and there's nothing like being a mental health therapist and self-diagnosing, really. I think there's something wrong. And I don't know if it's harder sometimes from a mental health professional to ask for help or to acknowledge our own need for support with our own mental health, but I certainly found that it was difficult to say, I think I'm depressed, I think I need some help. But it was a turning point when I could identify that. And I'm fond of saying I didn't know anybody that did yoga. It wasn't on my radar. Wasn't hanging out with anybody doing yoga. It wasn't popular as it is today and more mainstream. And it was just that I happened to be at a health club where it was part of my treatment, and I was working in the water and working in doing water aerobics um, several times a week. And it was in that space where I don't know if you've ever worked in a health club but they're usually desperate for instructors. And they're like, would you like to be a water aerobics instructor? And I was like, yes, of course. And it was because I was working there. They were like, well, we need yoga instructors. I'm like, yoga, what's that? And we'll train you. And I'm like, well, that sounds good. And so that was where the journey began, was a weekend yoga workshop. And I didn't even like it that much. It was hard, and I thought I was fit, and I thought I was a bit bendy. I was only in my 30s, and I wasn't able to do most of the things that I was learning. And so it was a little demoralizing. And I'm like, well, I don't really know why I'm bothering to do this. But 3 days later, that's sort of where the drama came in, is that I was pain free for the first time in 2 years. And as a young mother, I was in my late 30s, and I'd gone through this debilitating time of not being able to care for myself or my children. And then when the pain and the depression set in, uh, I didn't really know where to turn, and allopathic medicine didn't have a lot to offer me other than more medicine, possibly some surgeries. So things changed, something shifted. I couldn't explain what was happening at the time. I have more words now, but I still couldn't really put my finger on it. You probably would have a better idea with your knowledge of the different yoga systems and Ayurvedic medicine. But that started my path, and that led me to looking at different styles of yoga, everything from yoga fit to Iyengar yoga to um, Vini yoga, Kapala yoga. And these are all things that have sort of progressed my journey and my knowledge base to the point where I was then able to start teaching and opened a yoga studio. And I've been working mostly in hospitals, juvenile detention centers. I mean, along with working in a yoga studio, running a yoga studio for many years. So that's kind of how things evolved, but it was out of my own desperation, really.
Hmm. And so when you look back now with all that, like how would you say you were able to be pain-free in 3 days of yoga? Like, what do you think was happening there?
Well, I would say that there was some nervous system regulation that happened. And I think it's true that yoga is slow medicine. Like Timothy McCall talks about yoga being slow medicine. But sometimes, and in my case, that was quick medicine, and something was interrupted. And I think it was that I was stuck in my sympathetic nervous system in this activated state. And I'd been there for a very long time. And I practiced enough yoga, and I mean, it was a 2-day training. We were doing
Yeah.
we were doing things all day long, which is not how you would usually do yoga. Like you take a class, you have daily practice. That's the dosage. Um, but I had this, immediate large amounts of things from breathing and posture. So I think the nervous system regulation, something shifted. It allowed a little bit of tension to decrease. I think that impacted my ability to sleep, because not sleeping well and having lots of sleep disruption was one of my major symptoms at that time. And so there was some regulation happening. And this was all happening under conscious awareness. And that, so neuroception was happening. And maybe a little co-regulation with yoga teachers, some of those yogis, my nervous system finding some equilibrium and being able to be in parasympathetic, not only the rest and digest, that social engagement system, but also in that place of being able to safely be in the dorsal vagal system. And that's some of the things that I've written about and unpacked a little more in my book, because we don't need to know all of those words to, you know, took me 20 years to understand and have the language around those mechanisms. What I felt, my felt experience is something shifted. I could sleep better. I wasn't experiencing pain all the time. And that changed my life.
So I've been learning recently about how and this is mostly from Lorimer Mosley, about his work in pain in the brain and how.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that, about how pain comes in to protect, and the buffer of protection can become increasingly large, so we experience a lot more pain even though the bodily tissue isn't in danger, and how that,
Yeah.
like, what's going on there with the vagus nerve, and what's going on there with the sympathetic nervous system, and you can use whatever word you want.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. And fellow Australian, I really enjoy his work.
He's amazing, isn't he? Like, oh my gosh, he's so
He's
funny.
very
He could have been a
enjoyable to listen
comedian.
to and funny. Yeah. And I think one of the key things that I get from his work is um, that the nervous system does not distinguish between real and perceived pain. And if we pull the lens back a little bit to what people like psychiatrist Bessel van der Kolk is saying, is that the body is not distinguishing whether we're safe or not safe. It's tapping in with something triggers us. It's tapping into something in the past, and we get stuck there. And it doesn't matter if it's not really happening in the moment in front of us. And that's where having a regular yoga practice can help, because we can orient ourselves to the present moment, and we can learn to do that over time. So when we are aware, or we think we're unsafe or pain. So I'm using the sort of flip-flopping between the actual sense of physical pain in the body. And when I was in chronic pain, I was feeling physical pain in my body, even though I couldn't identify where. If you just said point to where the pain was, it was a global thing. And so what happens in the presence of that pain, I think it works similarly with physical pain and psychological pain, is that we go to that place as if that's happening now when it's not actually happening now. And some of our practices, particularly breathing practices and also some movement practices, can help us disrupt or interrupt the guarding that happens in our nervous system when we're stuck in something that's happening that's not real in the moment. So we can have this present moment experience. We can open our eyes. We can see that we're in a place of safety. We can notice that there's trees or there's a wall or there's a picture. We can orient to our present moment instead of guarding a little more. So physically, when we the body's had input that says if you move in this way, or if you walk too fast, or you lift your arms too high, you're going to experience that terrible pain, the debilitating pain that puts you to bed for 3 days, and you're not going to be able to do your job, or A, B, C, D. And so the body locks down in order to protect you. It's a survival mechanism because it thinks that you're at risk of hurting yourself. It may or may not be true. And that happens psychologically as well. We can perhaps we hear a piece of music or something that takes us back to a time where something horrifying happened to us, or it could be a weather event, or it could be an assault, it could be abuse of some sort. It's not actually happening in the present moment. And then it happens under conscious awareness, which Steve Porges coined the term neuroception. And so we've got this adaptive survival mechanism that's helping to protect us that goes on lockdown, and we either get ready to fight or flight, our sympathetic nervous system, or we go into the one of the two parts of the parasympathetic nervous system, the dorsal vagal system, where we collapse and we're immobilized, unable to run, and to the point it might even look like we're not breathing, not living, which would be called, the technical term would be death fainting, that some mammals do, and that some people who have experienced deep trauma go into this place of deep stillness and immobilization. And it wasn't a conscious choice. It was an adaptive survival mechanism. So that's my understanding and of the role of the vagus nerve then is tied in with how it governs those two parts of the parasympathetic nervous system. So our breath and our movement and what we learn from our yoga practice can then inform how, when we're not in crisis and we're not in this sense of danger, whether it's perceived or real, we can have these practices that then change that physiological response. We can start breathing instead of the neuroception things happening under conscious awareness. The vagus nerve is 80%, the superhighway. 80% of the information traveling along the vagus nerve goes from the body to the brain. So that's really good news, is that by using movement in the body and breath work, we can make some shifts and eventually have some agency over these states that we find ourselves in. And that happens with practice over time, and figuring out, what yoga poses are activating, which ones are calming. And you probably know this yourself from your own practice and working with so many people. Sometimes something is activating for you might be calming for me, and vice versa, along with a plethora of breathing practices. And I think people intuitively know that breathing slower will help to activate the parasympathetic, and you'll start to calm down. But I don't think it's as commonly known that when you speed the breath up and manipulate the breath, say as in bellows breath would be a good example, that that's usually activating and can mobilize you uh, to activate the sympathetic nervous system, because we need a little bit of that, especially if we tend towards depression. So I want to make sure I'm not going off on it. I enjoy talking about these different aspects of the nervous system, and don't want to go off on a tangent there.
No, it's all good. It's all good. So let's talk about trauma, because there's acute traumas like you had with a car accident, and then there's all these underlying traumas. And as people go on a healing journey, sometimes like the big obvious traumas in their life are processed, digested, released, and then there's underlying traumas that might, or at least is what we've really found, is like that might be more around childhood or birth traumas, or in utero trauma, or ancestral trauma. That's just the hereditary parenting pattern passed down, and that these can be sometimes even more difficult, even with people that have quite a lot of skills. Just like you mentioning being a mental health professional and having a hard, it's like self-diagnosis is hard. And so even though someone may have developed a lot of, I'll just say skillfulness and practice with meditation and breathing and yoga or other subtle body practices, they can, what I find is like hit a wall. And I find this personally, like hit a wall, and then some other key comes in, some other therapy, some other understanding comes in that allows that next level to be released. And I'm just curious what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so it was interesting that, it's easier to describe to you an event that was a car accident, right? That this was a trauma. It's more socially acceptable in it's factual, that's what happened. But what that revealed to me over time was an awareness of adverse childhood experiences that we know today as the ACEs. And there's lots of studies around this. And if you aren't familiar, if there's listeners that aren't familiar with ACEs, Googling largest public health study you've never heard of will give you some background on
ACES?
Yes.
Okay.
Adverse childhood experiences.
Okay. So we'll put a link to that in the chat, to the study. Thank you. Go ahead.
So I had awareness of things that I was aware of having a troubled childhood. And as I progressed on this journey and this physical healing and identifying there was depression all through this event of the car accident, I became more aware as I practiced yoga. And yoga is many things, but if we put it in some very basic of a way to care for ourselves, so self-care and increasing our self-awareness. As I cared for myself better and became aware of myself and bodily sensations, I also became aware of more things from my past, generational traumas. I became aware of that all was not well, that had nothing to do with the car accident itself. And I think that's what you're speaking of here, of this. So there's a very big pool, and that we're not always aware of these things that are in our background. I had some vague memories and some very real, some actual memories, but some of it had been hidden in my memory because it was difficult things. And so one of the things that I'm doing in the book is making an argument that whatever our training is in background, in a yoga lineage, that I'm making a case for a universal approach to looking at everybody as having trauma.
Mhm.
And we have evidence the prevalence of prevalence of trauma is not rare like we once thought. And so the ACE study has revealed that statistically speaking, it's 1 in 4 and sometimes higher than that of people that have experienced one or more of these adverse childhood experiences. And it's a scale of 1 to 10, and it's not a comprehensive list, it's only 10 questions. But I was a 7 out of 10 of some things I'd experienced. And what the study shows is that it correlates with things in your adult life for physical things like being more at risk for cardiovascular disease and more at risk for other physical and certainly for mental health issues later in life. So it's a fascinating study to look at. So taking all of that information, there's a really good chance in a class of 20 that you've got 4 or 5 people at least that have some sort of adverse childhood experience. And there are some things in some types of yoga teacher trainings that could uh, be triggering, that could be less than helpful.
I'm
And
remembering like the old school Iyengar style, like where there's actually aggression. Yeah.
So I didn't want to name names, but
I will. But
I
yeah, I mean, it's like we kind of learned and grew out of different things that were used in different cultures for different reasons, right? And now it's like
yeah,
the yoga's evolved a
yeah,
lot in the last few decades.
yeah. And so when we look at the vagus nerve, when we look at things like polyvagal theory, and even we can use that to inform what we do now and to make that trauma informed so that yoga can be part of the solution and not part of the problem, because there's a minefield of things that we could do and say how we say instruction, if we use too many words, not enough words,
Yeah.
if we take things too quickly. Very simple and basic things, the tone of our voice, where we position ourselves in the room, whether or not we touch people and how we adjust them. These are all ways that we can um, what I'm calling trauma informed yoga, ways that we can teach that seem like common sense and kind and compassion ways, but it still allow for us to teach in a lineage that we've been trained to teach and staying within the scope of practice that we've been trained in, but also to make it a welcoming, hospitable environment. Because one of the principles I talk about is making friends with your body. And we have to feel safe and be able to be in a space of co-regulation where we have done our own work, and that we're feeling, in order to be kind and compassionate in your classes, you have to feel kind and compassionate from caring for yourself and being on your own journey, doing your own work. And that I sometimes that seems like really obvious. I think part of my job is stating the obvious, but I'm realizing it's not inherent, and it's not actually obvious, but when we can look at that from a yogic perspective of how we deliver our training and instruction, and we can do that there's just many simple ways to do that, as I mentioned, of how the voice, and now we have science and words and theories, and how we how we create this, how we improve our vagal tone through our practice. We have some more anatomical and scientific backing to help us explain what the ancient yogis already knew, and we can just do that in a way that's trauma informed and can be really part of someone's healing journey, and instead somebody rolling up their yoga mat and heading out the door and throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Mhm. So I'm curious with 47 practices, there's a lot of practices to calm and balance and restore the nervous system. When you're going into, I'm going to throw a few different environments because you do work in prisons, you do work in hospitals, you do a lot of work in schools. What practices do you use with those that have had the most trauma first?
Yeah, I always try and I would say sneak in some breathing practices, but I usually don't start there. I start with something really simple like tone and listening to a chime, and I've sometimes played games using a chime to have people lean in and listen. It works really well with children, like raise your hand when you can't hear the chime anymore. So you're almost tricking your nervous system into listening, tuning in, even though we're distracted and doing lots of different things. And it works beautifully so many times. But it's also, I think that it's simple
Actually,
movement,
I want to
like
pause there
really
because
simple.
I was in Salt Lake City last weekend and the church bells rang, and the person I was with was just like, oh, I love the bells. And so we stopped and listened, and there's a reason town squares had church bells, or churches had, right. There's a reason this call to presence. There's a reason that there's, what are those little, the little circular, metal,
the little symbols.
Yeah. The little symbols
Yeah.
are used in yoga studios to start and end classes. It's like there's a way, right, that we're using the vibration of sound, particularly often with metal or glass, where there's a vibration in the atmosphere,
Yes.
and that's that vibration that's what hitting the inner ear and calming the nervous system. Is that what's going on?
I think so. And I use my singing bowls. I use the little chime. I have something in my purse somewhere when I go to teach a class. Unless you're in a jail, you can't take anything at all, but I usually can have something. And
that's interesting, because then you can use your voice, right? And that's where chanting comes in.
So you can use your voice, and you can use chants and tones. And I think that when people will be like, oh, I don't want to do that particular aspect, or I don't like it. It's when we create a space that feels safe enough to try something, even if it's not within cultural experience or something you've watched on YouTube lately, that people will follow your lead when you suggest something kindly and compassionately, even when it seems weird or silly. And I find this, I've seen this time and time again with children in lots of different situations. Like this afternoon, I'm going to be teaching a group of middle schoolers in an after-school program that all have high ACE scores. They all have a lot of trauma present, a lot of grief. They love we now have to take turns. There's a turn taking of who's allowed to use the chime today. And they want to play the chime. We do it 3 times, and you have to put your hand up when you can't hear it anymore. And this is allowed and they've been in school all day, and they've been told to sit still and be quiet. And who wants to sit still again? But they come in and they want to hear, and they want to see that everybody hears it just a little bit differently. And they want to raise, the game is to raise your hand when you can't hear it anymore. And I've done that with adults. I've done that with all sorts of people. When you create that space, ask them to do something, show them, and then having them see that success is hearing, raising your hand. There's something shifts in the space. And so it's just beginning with that very basic thing. And sometimes I'll use my Tibetan singing bowl and play that, or the little symbols that you said. And it's laying that groundwork that this is a place that we can connect to our bodies, and we're going to listen, and we're going to notice if we're sad, we're going to notice if we're angry, we're going to notice if this makes us happy, whatever it is, we're going to notice that. And often when we'll do some of these practices, and we'll do the Shavasana at the end, and some of them will fall asleep. I mean, it's 5 minutes and they're out cold. And that tells me that they're exhausted. Yeah. If you can fall dead asleep in an after school program where there's lots of other things going on, and you're not getting enough rest. And they think that yoga makes them tired, when it's not really yoga making them tired. It's just revealing something that's happening in the nervous system, and that they needed it allowed them to rest even for a few minutes. So these are all the revealing practices, and that just a little bit of movement goes a long way. Because I see people of all sorts of abilities in terms of being able to move their bodies, or being in wheelchairs, or having prosthetics, or just a rigidity in their body from all the tension. And so it has to be super simple. But we work on the principles of linking your breath to your movement. Sounds so easy, especially if you practice yoga for a while. But when you start, it's like, where do I inhale and
Oh no, I
exhale?
got called out by a teacher, and I was already through I went to the Iyengar teacher training program, which is a 2-year program. And then I started my Anusara training. And this was in I think the early 2000s and whatnot. And my teacher was like, you're leading with your mind, not your breath. And that was years into. So I would say it just shows how where are you? Where are you? Right. And when we can link our awareness from our breath, we can we can enter another dimension of being present.
I want you to try and go in and notice before that, and do a little less. And it's, again, it sounds easy and simple, and it's not. And particularly when you've had pain, like just taking your hands up and inhaling them up and exhaling them down. Well, maybe you can't do that. Maybe you can just lift your elbows up. Or maybe you can lift them up to here and just bring your hands gently down. But noticing before you go, or you start to grip and guard, and there's tension again. And we work on this constantly every week. And over time, they're starting to, I say notice ad nauseum. Just notice, just notice. And that act of noticing and suggesting that there is something going on inside that you can pay attention to. I mean, interoceptive awareness, right? But it's very helpful to be able to read your body, read the cues of your body, and some, of all of the things that happen when we don't, physically and mentally, that happen when we don't read the cues of the body. Well, we don't go to the bathroom when we need to, or we don't hydrate when we need to. We don't eat when we're actually hungry. Yoga practice is a practice that helps us develop reading the cues. And hopefully when we read the cues, then we do something about that. Maybe we need the hug. We need to get that oxytocin of hugging another person and having appropriate consensual touch. But when we understand and we can piece all that together, I think that's kind of the hallmark of that self-awareness and self-care piece. And so that's what I'm working on with middle schoolers this afternoon. But sometimes I'll be working with veterans that have, active PTSD. It's a very tough space to work in. And being quiet and doing a quiet visualization isn't going to work in the case of when somebody's in the acute phase of mental illness. You might want to have something a little bit more active, a little bit more using the entire body, doing something simple like a seated cat and cow. That's a nice place to start if that's accessible to someone.
And so the more acute, the more it's what I'm thinking of in terms of prana in the body. It's like the more you want to release the prana to be able to then allow the nervous system to calm, and then to do more quieting practice, with the example of the PTSD acute. Yeah.
Yeah. And sometimes, let's move. I'll go to say, someone who's feeling highly anxious. You would think, well, we want to bring that energy down, so maybe we do a calming practice, but they might not be ready. And one of my trainings is, part of my background is in life force yoga, and we have a term called meeting the mood. And so sometimes meeting the higher energy with something a little more energetic, or doing a bellows breath with an arm movement and doing that type of, that's usually an energizing practice. Someone who's already feeling highly anxious might be a little reluctant to try that because they don't want to send their energy, even it's unmanageable as it is, and they don't want to send it up. But sometimes if you know them, you've been working with them for a little bit, sending the energy up can then actually bring it down.
Mm-hmm.
And that usually happens within the first minute or so. And so being able to see, I was mentioning earlier about the yoga being slow medicine, but at the same time, the reason I included these particular 47 practices is because I have seen them work in the moment, within seconds, make a small shift. Now, it doesn't last for, hours, but it is a noticeable shift in the nervous system that I can either see or they can feel. More importantly, that they can feel in their nervous system. And if it, then we can say, well, if that felt good, we can try that again, or we can pair that with something else. And that sort of movement, I think, is really helpful. Because if somebody's at the opposite end of the spectrum and they've got low energy and they're feeling depressed, then having something to pick your energy up. But you can't start with a fast
Right.
practice because it'll be like, oh, I don't have the energy for that. You've got to start a little slowly, but not too slow. Like you might not do alternate nostril breathing. You might pick something that's a little more balancing, maybe like a like stair step breathing, like a Voloma 1, and just experiment a little bit. Let's see how this feels in your nervous system, and to gradually build up so that they can tolerate being activated, because they might, we want to have more resilience where we can toggle between these states of, I say, like when you're in anxiety and a 9 or a 10 and it's unmanageable, I just say that in terms of energy. I find that that's helpful for most people, whether or not you've got an anxiety disorder or clinical depression, but more of a depressed state at 1 or 2 where you can barely get out of bed. But we all want to be like between 4 and 6. If we're on that, 10 is too much and 1 is too little. And so we can look at those practices and how they move us back and forth, which will be different for you, different for me. There's some reliability in probably bellows breath is going to take your energy up, but you got to try it enough times to see how it feels. And then using an image, like I have an image of a tool belt. The one side of your tool belt is calming and one pocket in your tool belt is energizing, and there's an in-between one where you're not quite sure, or it just feels a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
And that's true of many practices too. It gives people an image of where to put it so that they can retrieve it. It's really a memory retrieval system so that you can use it then. And it doesn't matter if you how well you can do cat and cow and if you're getting the inhales and the exhales right. The point is the effect of the breath, and where would it be useful again in if something's going down and you're feeling your anxiety rising, or you really want to have an important conversation that you want to be present and accounted for. Perhaps there's a practice you could do that would help. And that's where our practice, that's for me, it's where the rubber meets the road. What's the effect? And how is it duplicatable? Can I do that? Can I replicate that easily in a different setting when I'm noticing these things going on in my nervous system? That gives us resilience, this flexibility in our nervous system. We all want this more flexibility in our body, and you may or may not get that from gentle and restorative yoga, but you'll at least be in what your pain-free range is. But we want to develop this flexibility and resilience in being able to toggle between states in the nervous system. The part that is previously we would just get hijacked by things, we can now have some agency with time and practice that allows for this capacity, some capacity for choice. Doesn't mean that we would never be hijacked or get anxious or scared, or but in recognizing that we can take back some agency. And I
Yeah,
think
that's
that's
right.
one of
Like it's
the
not whether or not we'll be
exciting
triggered in
things.
the future. It's how quickly we can then apply a tool and experience what we want to experience next.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad that we had a chance to really talk about, just these levels of trauma and the levels of practice. So any in conclusion, like any advice to therapists? You've already given a lot of advice to therapists, but any other key takeaways? Like, and I can recap some of the ones that I heard. Like one is like, do the practices yourself. Be kind to yourself if you want to be kind to others. The others are using these shorter practices, and whether it's through sound or whether it's through a breath technique or cat cow or movement breath technique. That these things don't have to be big, long practices. Because I think a lot of people get triggered in their home practice by making it too challenging rather than short enough to just do regularly and to mix it up. That's what I'm also hearing is like mix it up, know all the tools in your toolkit and keep them in use.
Yeah. And so it's taking your own medicine, right? And if you're not practicing, or if you're feeling things are a little on the busy side, then to take a class or do your practice, then maybe that's too busy. And that's not to judge anybody that's in a heavy season in life, but we do have to, I think we need to do better at how we care for ourselves. We have to take our own medicine and understand if we're going to be yoga teachers or therapists, the importance of how we care for ourselves will show up on the mat, it will show up in the counseling room, and that how we are being in the moment and our presence with another is the primary vehicle for healing. So I would say prepare yourself, take your own medicine, and if nothing else, slow the practice down. If you only slow it down, what you're, or whatever it is you're doing that you're skilled at doing, that you've trained to do, slow it down, slow down your speech, take some pauses. You'll be amazed at what you notice in yourself and what you have then time to see and observe in the people in front of you, and your clients, people in your classes. And that you don't have to fill up every moment with words.
I love it.
I used to be like, so everything had to be efficient and quick, and I've learned that that's actually not true. Sure that some things need to be efficient, but teaching yoga does not.
It reminds me, my daughter was in a
healing.
soccer.
This is slowing.
It's slowing. My daughter was she was playing soccer in a game the other day, and she and another player, they collided like bone to bone, and in like they didn't see it coming, so there was no ability to it's just like they both fell over, and she was hurt and carried to the sideline. And I did this something I learned in therapeutic yoga where you take your two hands, you take one hand on someone's forehead and the other behind their neck right at the base of the skull, and you just apply basically like an even pressure, that it's like loving presence through pressure, something like that. Yes. And she was laying down, and I'm like, we're just going to do this until we know what's going on, like until we have any idea, because her nervous system was totally tweaking out, and she's definitely in pain, and it's surging, and she's also disoriented and all the things. And it was interesting to see how different people react to healing, to trauma, to acute situations and whatnot. Because I'm like, we're just going to do this until like there's some signal to do something else. Right. And that might be 5 minutes. It might be 20 minutes. I have no idea how long it's going to take. And people were pretty uncomfortable with that because they wanted to know what was wrong. And I'm like, what is wrong is her nervous system is just releasing energy, and we're going to be present with it. And I learned that from Peter Levine, that healing trauma, that approach of just let the body shake it out. Like, let the body process what happened. Don't rush right after something happens. Like, just go exactly to what you're saying. Go really slow into the present and all of the sensations that are arising right in the present. And like, sure enough, whatever it was, 20 minutes later, she was like, oh, and you could see her consciousness shifted back into waking state consciousness. And she's like, I think I'm all right. And it was that, like, her nervous system knew that nothing was really, really wrong. I mean, yeah, she couldn't walk and she had a big bruise and blah, 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 at the level of bone and nerve. But like, there was that she was okay in herself with the experience that had happened. And it just taught me, like, time and time again, like, that slowing down. And as therapists, as leaders, as parents, it's like, we've got to be willing to make a stand for slow when a lot of people around us are going to try to speed up a situation out of sync or out of rhythm with the present.
Yeah, great example.
Awesome. So I'm going to get your book. Everyone else, you should get this book, that are anyone working with trauma or working with kids, working with yourself, right? As we all are. So again, this was Joanne Spence, Trauma Informed Yoga, a toolbox for therapists, 47 practices to calm, balance, and restore the nervous system. Thanks so much, Joanne. Great to hang out.
Thanks. It was great hanging out with you, Kate.